Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. I recently watched an interesting documentary called Turning Point, The Bomb in the Cold War. It was on Netflix. It was a great watch, and I'd highly recommend it. Essentially, it positioned nearly every prominent geopolitical event since World War II as fallout from the U.S. dropping the nuclear bomb on Japan to end World War II. That program came to mind in preparing for this episode, as we can look at a number of recent, major cybersecurity events that have their origins in attacks on critical infrastructure. Whether you want to go all the way back to Stuxnet or more recent developments like Colonial Pipeline, hackers realize that the control systems utilized in these environments mirror those used by manufacturers like Boeing, Clorox, Johnson Controls, and many others who have been the victims of high-profile hacks. Our guest for today's episode is going to help us dive into the dynamics of these types of attacks and their legacy in industrial cybersecurity. It's my pleasure to welcome Bill Moore to the show. He's the founder and CEO of XONA Systems, a leading provider of secure access solutions. Bill, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach. Jumping right into things here a little bit, I thought maybe you could talk to us on when it comes to the critical infrastructure side of things. What are some of the biggest vulnerabilities you're seeing, or some of the biggest challenges that are stemming from that side of the industrial sector?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest vulnerability that I see is really the exposure of the protocols that are used. Because when we talk about industrial control systems and OT, many times we're not necessarily talking about sort of the down to the logic controllers and all of that get programmed, but it's really the digital interfaces, the engineering workstations, the what are called HMIs and SCADA applications and things that interface with all of those process controllers and logic controllers, right? And so they tend to use protocols that you would see in an IT network, like RDP or VNC or web protocol, depending on the interface. And, you know, if you look at just over the last couple years, some of the reports that have come out just on RDP, it was used in 90% of all ransomware attacks, at least partially, which is unbelievable, actually. You know, that we're this far into bringing out all of these digital, the digital edge is growing, and we're expanding all of this, and it seems like this was sort of OT and industrial control systems were kind of forgotten about a little bit, right? It's sort of a set it and forget it kind of systems. You know, you see a lot more legacy systems. It's not typically systems that connect to the cloud, so it's more difficult to modernize, update, patch and things like that, right?
So what do you think are some of the biggest factors playing into some of those struggles that we're having in terms of updating those legacy systems or getting past a little bit of that mindset of set it and forget it? We're in this new age of cybersecurity where everybody is increasingly vulnerable. Is this a funding thing? Is this a training thing? Is this just an awareness thing? Or are all of these sort of converging to create a lot of these challenges?
Yeah, I think some of it is I would add one more as a cultural thing too, but there's a training aspect of this. But most importantly, these systems are 24/7 systems, right? So when you have to update something, it's not sort of, hey, I was going to say up until the CrowdStrike incident, it's easier to do this in IT without ramifications. But yeah, typically in OT, you don't want auto update on ever, right? You don't want things like that. You have to do kind of a test site. You have to work around maintenance windows, right, where there's scheduled downtime and things like that. And so those are usually very narrow windows. The way things get updated you have to do this very carefully and thoughtfully. And so, and in some cases, you can't really update these systems. I mean, we're talking about operating systems that may be not supported anymore, that are kind of the underlying OS on some of these systems, right? These control systems they do have display protocols and digital protocols that they use, like VNC and RDP, but you may be talking about something like Windows 7, right? That's 20 years old now. So there's a number of things that are kind of, I think, going back to what you said, I think they're kind of converged into this, around just the difference in OT versus IT, and that goes for visibility as well, and how you go out and try to discover these systems, right? They tend to be more fragile in the way that they interact. So, you want to be careful in how you scan them and things like that, right? So, yeah.
One of the things, whenever we've talked to cybersecurity experts, specifically about critical infrastructure and utilities and things of that nature, it feels like all the challenges we have in the manufacturing or on the plant floor are really just turned up to 11 or ratcheted up even more so when we get into municipalities, wastewater treatment facilities, whatever the case may be. And yet there's still a real funding concern. That seems to be one of the biggest reoccurring issues, is getting funding for cybersecurity embedded within these organizations. What do you think is the biggest challenge there? Why are we struggling so much to get the dollars?
Yeah. There's a big irony here too, because there's a lot of these things that are moving to digital interfaces and IoT so that more data can be extracted off of these devices without doing truck rolls and having people go out to all of these. And some of these are very remote sites when you're talking about wind farms, solar farms, even water and wastewater facilities in rural communities are difficult to get people out there to update systems or to troubleshoot systems. So the idea is that they won't. They're kind of you're right. They're cash strapped, particularly smaller utilities, rural utilities in small cities and towns. So one of the approaches that we've taken here is to look at this, kind of holistically, and looking at sort of all the technology debt and sort of how do you provide identity and access management? How do you manage that attack surface, right? From a secure access standpoint, and then always, how do you also meet the compliance and all the regulations? And so, and governance and audit and all of that. So, we've taken an approach that really you need a kind of a next generation access solution, a next generation identity solution, secure access solution. So it's and with that comes, kind of saying we're not going to take what's kind of the legacy stuff in IT and sort of mirror it over to OT. It just doesn't work, right? There's different requirements. So it really requires something new to be built, right? And you've seen this in the visibility and sort of IDS systems and visibility and vulnerability management systems specific for OT, right? And the same thing for access control, and really trying to compress the protocols down and not allow communication protocols like RDP and VNC to come out of that network and extend out to to the remote user or wherever they may be. Either they could be in an IT network or they could be coming in over the internet. So the idea is to really manage that attack surface, manage the access management, and do it in a more elegant way without drag along technology debt from IT.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard you bring up sort of the IT side of things a number of times. Is it a bigger problem within the critical infrastructure community to get away from just sort of mirroring what we've done in IT and trying to bring that over to OT? It's a problem in manufacturing. Is it a bigger issue with some of the folks that you're working with?
Yeah, I think what's happened is in IT, you've had this movement of all of these systems from being in sort of traditional data centers and things like that to more cloud. Everything's cloud scaled to an IT. So there's been this aggregation and centralization of resources in IT for a lot of it for cost reasons, right? And to be able to manage the costs from an OpEx standpoint. With the OT and all of these new digital assets that are being deployed in IoT and Industrial Internet of Things and and all kinds of things that are, and all of the greenfield, OT or digital assets are being deployed with solar farms, wind farms, battery farms are going, everywhere like crazy. That's just in the energy sector. But you see that, a lot more digital assets being deployed on production lines and things like that, so they could get, more flexibility, more automation, all of that, right? So yeah, it's kind of an interesting conundrum because a lot of these systems, they don't connect to the cloud, and they don't want to connect to the cloud, and they really can't. Now you could do maybe some of the stuff, and you could send data, and analysis can be done in the cloud from the data that comes off of these lines. But in terms of access to these assets, you really have an issue because if you use traditional IT kind of tools for this, or I would say legacy IT tools like VPNs and jump servers and things like that, you're not really solving the problem of potential attacks and ransomware and things like that on these lines, because VPNs get decrypted at an endpoint. If there's malware on that remote endpoint, now there's a way for attackers to get into the network, right? Especially into these critical networks. So yeah, it's an interesting problem, and just because IT and OT are kind of going in separate directions, OT is becoming more distributed while IT is becoming more centralized. So
yeah, it is interesting. Again, following in that theme, everything just becomes that much more significant and that much louder when you're dealing with critical infrastructure like utilities and wastewater treatment and all that kind of stuff. It feels like a lot of the tightrope they need to walk, these organizations need to walk in terms of being secure but still being up to date, is even more challenging than in manufacturing. How do you help these folks? And we're going to talk more specifically about what you guys do, but maybe this is a good time to do it. How are these organizations sort of walking that tightrope between we have to be secure, but we can't leverage all of these other tools because the cloud may not be the right fit for us? We can't share all of this data like maybe a private enterprise would. How do they walk that line between updating a lot of legacy stuff but still staying safe and secure, I guess?
So when I talk about really managing the attack surface, this kind of gets into our solution. We call protocol isolation. So it's really when you basically you want to have a device that can be both an authenticator and then also put role-based and time-based access controls and very granular authorization to each system. You also want it to be very frictionless in terms of the way users come in, because a lot of these systems, whether it's manufacturing or energy or oil and gas, they have a lot of OEMs that need to come in through these networks, and they need that better governance. I've seen a shift there where the governance is getting more and more important, and the risk management from the organizations. It used to be a little bit of the Wild West with OEMs kind of controlling those networks themselves, and the asset owners not really understanding everything they're doing. But what we've seen in one particular use case is this idea of vendor agnostic remote operations. So having all the OEMs kind of come through a central point, and then they only see the assets that they can connect to, but then there's this ability to have control and audit and all of that's uniform. So now the organization can get a handle on what all of their OEMs are doing. And from the way we do it, that's we make this very frictionless in terms of they're making sure it's clientless and web-based in terms of the connection from the outside. That's very important because the security of things has to be easy to put in. It can't be onerous. You can't be putting agents on everything, because then it gets more challenging from a deployment perspective, and that can slow down the adoption, right? So, kind of the legacy technologies like VDI, Citrix, and all kinds of different VPNs, you have a mismatch in access methodology between the organization and its third parties and its OEMs. So making this, more flat in terms of the access in, and then also not on the cyber digital assets we call the OT side. You want to make sure how those are authorized and connected to. You're not adding unnecessary agent software and things like that. Using the existing system, right? That's already in place there. But yeah, I think from an authentication perspective, I can, I've been in an organization where the digital asset was so old, the HMI, that it wouldn't allow more than a 7-character password. I mean, it was like an 8-bit system, but it was a digital interface, and it could run VNC server on it. So it's interesting, how old these systems are. So you really need that hard authentication layer to kind of take over that and sort of be the broker for the authentication and authorization to these systems.
You brought up a couple of pretty kind of interesting points there. Number one, and we're hearing more of this, is sort of those time-based authentications or time-based access strategies. Yeah. It seems like that's been kind of slow to pick up, and I've never understood why, especially for smaller organizations. That seems to make all the sense in the world. Do you have any insight on as to maybe why that isn't a more widely adapted strategy?
It's a great question. I think there hasn't been efficient tools to do that. I think it's, again, going into IT, it's just one, those types of things require usually some customization a lot of times. So, in OT, there's some very specific differences that you can do that can actually provide, higher level of forensic data and provide more granular authorization that are harder, I think, just harder to do in IT because you're dealing with all different types of users and different, permission levels and things like that. And then you're also dealing with hundreds or thousands of applications. And so it gets to be, it's a more complex problem in IT generally. In OT, it's usually not that as many users and there's not that many assets. So, and it's intermittent access, right? So the time-based access control, I think, in IT, I don't think it's thought of that much because, hey, we just want people working 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week or more, right? In OT, you have maintenance windows and things like that. So I think, you know, we've seen organizations where the way they manage it is they literally have their remote access turned off physically, the gateway or whatever's turned off, and then they turn it on when somebody needs access. I mean, it's kind of archaic, but you can now do that in software and manage it more effectively, and then you have the logging of all of this, which is important to know when organizations are coming into the network and so forth, right? The other part of this too is having site level. There's a couple other elements here. The site level controls are really important too, because sometimes you want to make sure that when somebody's coming in. So even though it may be a maintenance window, you still want to know when they're going to connect, right? So you want to have somebody in a control room say, yes, I'm approving this person to access this particular digital asset right now, right? So, and having that logged is important, right? So if you go back and for troubleshooting or things like that. Same thing with user access recordings. Being able to see a movie of everything the user did on that system is important. And it's practical in OT and not so much in IT, right? It's just not just because the intermittent nature of connectivity in OT.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking about access. You mentioned ransomware a lot, and we're talking critical infrastructure. I guess there's no way we can not talk a little bit about the legacy sort of the Colonial Pipeline attack and the impact that's had. I really have always looked at it as sort of a turning point in this new age of industrial cybersecurity. It just raised everybody's awareness so much of how vulnerable we are. What have you seen in being a little bit closer to this sector in terms of the impacts or lessons learned that hack had?
Yeah, well, I think in that particular case, it was one of the big lessons learned there was the nature of how IT and OT is blending in terms of how the automation, right? Because what you had in that particular case it wasn't an OT system that was compromised, it was really an IT system. But that billing system got updates from meters that were on the pipeline that would tell it how much to bill, whatever, company was taking fuel off the pipeline. So, and just it really shut down that visibility there, right? So that caused the cascading effect of coming down. So I think I think the lesson here is to really, help map out what's critical, right? And not this sort of, oh, that's OT, this is IT, and but I think it uplifted everybody's concern that, hey, whether it's IT or OT, a pipeline business like Colonial is critical infrastructure, right? The entire holistically the business itself, and so I think that that's ratcheted things up, and obviously there's been a lot of CISA guidelines around that. There's the TSA 2021 dash 2D, I believe, is the latest directive, and that's specifically for pipelines, and it's put a security directive around incident response plans, all of these things, but also the tools to make sure that MFA is being used and various other things. So yeah, so I mean, there's new regulations, from our company personally. That regulation has actually led to more midstream pipelines adopting our technology. So we have several customers now that have come out of that, and I think a lot of it had to do with the response, to that, to what happened there in the new TSA directives, and needing a sort of a zero trust architecture for that, right?
Yeah, no, it's been interesting. I mean, the regulatory fallout, if you will, from that attack has been pretty widespread. It's really started with, that we initially said the critical infrastructure, whether it's utilities, hospitals, even some financial institutions having to report those types of attacks and letting people know. That kind of produced, I think, a lot of the SEC regulations, where now companies have to disclose information if they are publicly traded, and let people know that they were hit and any type of costs associated with it. It always leads to that question then, do we have enough regulatory action? Do we need more? Has it gone too far? How far should we take it? Because with a lot of small manufacturers who are not publicly traded, are not considered critical infrastructure, if you will, there's a lot of activity that's probably still staying in the dark. Some of that may be okay because they're handling it internally and they don't want to deal with the reputation issues, but at the same time, maybe we're not sharing enough information too. I'd kind of like to get your thought there in terms of what is the right place for the regulation.
Yeah, man, this is we could probably talk a couple more hours just about this, but yeah,
Yeah.
look, I think the ISACs in the various market segments are really important, right? All of that information sharing on what's going on in terms of vulnerabilities and threats and so forth is really important. So I think that's number one. That's the most important thing, is that these different market segments are sharing information about what's going on, in terms of all the vulnerabilities and threats, right? The regulation can be problematic because if sometimes it can be too onerous, sometimes it gets kind of a blanket over, like you said, across manufacturing, where obviously a chemical manufacturer is more important than probably a pulp and paper manufacturer, right? So things like that in terms of critical infrastructure. So and just what can happen if something bad happens in terms of the fallout, right? So yeah, so I think there needs to be so regulations and compliance and things that get implemented, they need to be enforceable if they're going to be implemented. So if you just kind of put it out there, and people aren't going to pay attention unless there's some teeth to it, unless people get fined if they don't meet it. So, but again, there has to, it can't be overburdensome. There have to be some just basic things that, from my perspective, that I think you have to do. Like, you have to keep communication protocols that are used in 90% of ransomware attacks, in the zone of that manufacturing plant, and not allow them to go out to the internet or to IT networks and things like that. You got to manage that zone. You got to have multi-factor authentication. I mean, that's sort of the basics, right? You got to limit the attack surface. Strong authentication are just some things that I think there should be teeth on, in terms of compliance, and folks need to recognize that this is super important to do those things. Outside of that, I mean, it gets there's a lot of other things that are difficult, right, to do, and have really very complete incident response plans. I mean, as long as there's templates, I think some of these organizations should probably help, you know, make it easier for these organizations to meet some of these guidelines by saying, hey, here's kind of the checklist. Here's what we're going to come around and check. Here's sort of the minimum state you need to be in, to avoid fines and things like that, right? So.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be some remediation support there as well. Especially for the smaller manufacturers, the insurance element of it is becoming less and less helpful. I mean, so if somebody does get hit, they can't really rely on that like maybe they could in the past. So maybe, again, for the smaller guys, to help them be a little bit more forthcoming and help us learn about this stuff more, I don't know, maybe some regulatory help there and helping them get back in the game too once they're hit. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think anything that can help streamline the process and for smaller manufacturers, like you said, that are not publicly traded. But yeah, I mean, there's these issues are and again, it's difficult sometimes to say, really, I think anything with industrial control systems should be critical infrastructure because it's people can get hurt in the plant, even if like I mentioned chemical plant versus pulp and paper, mainly because if there was some sort of chemical thing that blew up or whatever, it could affect the not just the people that work there, but the wider population. So, but it's still critical, right? And if things go wrong in any kind of plant, right, there's safety issues with the workers there. So, I didn't want to kind of gloss over that, but it's just, yeah, I mean, I think there is certain segments you have to have a little bit more stringent, approach to, just because, if something goes wrong, it affects so many more people, right? So.
Very fair. And this might lead into a little bit of more conversation of the things that XONA does, but you mentioned visibility a couple of times, and that's an issue throughout the industrial sector, regardless if it's manufacturing, critical infrastructure, or what have you. There's a lot of different factors that play into those visibility challenges, whether it's updating legacy equipment with new stuff, the number of growing connection points. You mentioned cloud before. There's a lot of different things that make it harder for an organization to understand the scope of their threat landscape, if you will. Is there one that sort of sticks out to you as that maybe can be a priority or a first step in really achieving better visibility throughout your company, throughout your organization?
Yeah, I mean, well, visibility, I mean, is you have to know what you have to protect. So, I mean, number one is you got to get a handle on what your assets are, right? And again, there's different tools out there for that can use things like passive scanning and so forth to gather a lot of information about what's out there that you need to protect. So, getting the inventory of those, and then, but equally important is which ones are communicating, right? And what are they communicating, right? Are they communicating routable IP protocols, TCP/IP protocols, or are they communicating something that's, maybe not as, maybe could be used if there was a targeted nation state attack or something on a very particular OT protocol that's not routable, but that's when you talk about Stuxnet and some of the older things that would get into specific manufacturers of systems. But yeah, you definitely want to say, is any of these communication protocols going outside of the zone of that manufacturing plant, power plant, whatever it may be? You want to make sure that those communication protocols are only being used in that local area network, only in that enclave, in that zone, for specific access, right? There's no reason with today's technologies that you need to be tunneling RDP or VNC out to the internet. It's just it shouldn't be done in IT networks, and it should be literally, there should be teeth around the compliance around that particular thing in OT, just because of the public safety issues around that. So.
Absolutely. So, Bill, tell us a little bit more about XONA. You mentioned some of the things that you're doing out there. I know you guys have some pretty strong roots within the critical infrastructure facility as well as accessibility throughout these organizations and working with them. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you guys do.
Yeah, so we have a what we call our XONA Secure Access Platform, and essentially it can be used for remote access, can be used for kind of local access. It's really a all-encompassing identity and user access platform that that users can kind of come into the network in a much more efficient way, in a much more frictionless way than sort of some of the legacy technologies. And so, as I mentioned before, we implement things like multi-factor authentication, protocol isolation, and that really speaks to sort of the attack surface management aspect of things and keeping those protocols local. We also tie in our technology and map those to the different regulations, whether it's NIS2 in Europe or NERC-CIP or NIST 800-53 or whatever it may, IEC 6443. There are a number of these, right? And so we want to make sure that everything that we're providing maps to all of that. But really, there's a lot of these things that we do that are OT specific because we think about the availability and the safety of these systems, right? So it's not just the MFA, but it's having the site level controls, things like virtual wait lobby that we implement. So that's a safety mechanism. So somebody just doesn't remote into a system that might be not in a maintenance window, but for some reason under maintenance, people can get hurt. So you want to make sure that, how people are connecting to those systems are different. You also want to have things like user access recording that we implement so that, if you want to go back and if there was a problem, maybe it was a cyber incident, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was, operator error, you want to go back and look at the movie of what they did, right? So we take the approach that, we integrate this as a cyber system, our platform, and it's not just about, aligning to zero trust architecture or aligning to compliance. It's really about reducing operational costs, right? Limiting truck rolls, operational efficiency, because you don't have, to drag along an IT administrator with you every time you want to do something, be able to have operators that you assign as with roles of administrator or assign the roles of, moderator, that they can moderate access or moderate the transfer of a file into the OT system. So yeah, you want to have sort of a, one interface to kind of manage all of the aspects of that, right?
In a lot of cases, and we saw this with the recent PLC attack that ended up, it was basically targeted at Israeli water treatment facilities, but it ended up affecting breweries and other places here in the U.S. And just to see the way that proliferates it's scary, but you also have to wonder, there's just so many unintentional targets that are being affected by this type of activity. What is the best is it just having a good response plan ready, or is there something that we can do to identify or anticipate these types of attacks maybe a little bit better?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of these new devices that are going in, they kind of built in cellular communications and things like that. And anything that's going to be communicating out to the internet, whatever it is, you need to take a hard look at that and determine, is that something that we want to have communicating in that manner, where we just want to have putting out things that communicate directly to the cloud, or some, say it's some sort of IoT metering device that does something very fancy and automates some things and gets data and sends it to the cloud. I'm like, okay, well, that could be problematic, right? Because if it's not secure and those protocols are leaving there, they can be intercepted, right? So I think it's a matter of saying, okay, if we're going to do this with IoT, how are we going to have the communications of this information? How is it going to flow, and create zones around that communication so that the communication flows through a mechanism that can be managed and the attack surface can be limited, right? Because once you put in those devices that are communicating over cell modems, I mean, you're just expanding your attack surface, right? So yeah, it's convenient, but I think there's an education that needs to be done there so that people understand that, just because somebody says, oh, this only communicates one way to our cloud, and they can't blindly believe the vendor, right? you know and even if they're accurate in that, how are they securing that communications in their cloud, right? And so it's kind of a little bit of a Pandora's box there, and it's just it's it's a big problem, yeah, but education is a big part of it.
Well, it's so interesting because we keep talking about all these different challenges, and it seems to always go back to some really basic stuff, some real, like I always call blocking and tackling, which is understand what you're implementing. And I think the issue there, the challenge is a lot of this technology isn't that complex. It's very easy to understand and very easy to implement, and a lot of times very cost effective and easy to see the benefits. But taking that extra minute and just pause and think about it from a security perspective, and understanding anytime you open a door, it swings both ways. So just because you can get out, I mean, people can come in too. So
yeah, I mean, you can still get the advantage of those types of tools. It's just, let's have the information flow in a way that's being monitored and understood, that, hey, the only communication flow is coming through, the security pieces that it needs to come through, and not just kind of everywhere, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to something you brought up very early in the conversation, which is culture. And we keep hearing about that a lot when it comes to cybersecurity concerns in any organization. What have you seen or what have you experienced in the companies that are working to instill the type of cybersecurity culture you would want? Where does it start? How does it spread versus maybe those who are still struggling with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really obviously goes up to the CISO or chief security officer to understand that, how important their industrial controls are to the business, because then it really is, in the case of manufacturing, it's all of their business, right? It is their business, right? So there has to be understanding all the way up to the C level. One of the titles that I've seen over the last few years that is important, I think, especially really in any organization, but is to have that director of OT cybersecurity, right? That person that kind of can report directly to the CISO and have that, hey, this is what's going on the cybersecurity. Here's how we're protecting our digital assets and our industrial control systems. Yeah.
So Bill, here's the $1 million question. Do you grow that person? Do you train that person, and or do you go out and find them? How do you get that person? Because I think you're absolutely right. Everybody needs them. That's just the dilemma there.
Yeah. I think probably the best place to train, I think, yeah, there is some training involved, but I think it's taking that automation controls engineer or SCADA engineer that's been doing this for, at least, a significant amount of time, and kind of getting them or talking to them about becoming a cybersecurity practitioner as well. And maybe, you start kind of small, you start with training the person that wants to do it. They may want to, they may have done automation controls and for 15, 20 years, and they're, try something different kind of thing, right? So I think getting them out of the OT world, because they already have the technical expertise, they're engineers, so, and they understand the business, right? So that's probably the best place to look.
So Bill, kind of wrapping things up here a little bit, we've talked about a lot of different challenges, a lot of different topics here, but is there one that sticks out in your mind that may have the most impact in the near future here for industrial cybersecurity?
I think that there's going to be sort of a change to, and sort of kind of the legacy way of doing things in terms of privileged access management and identity and access management. I mean, there's a lot of interesting technologies, but I think what's going to happen is it's going to kind of coalesce into kind of a next generation tool set for that, because this is sort of, once you get visibility, and we've done a pretty good job, I think, in over the last 5 to 10 years, and a lot of companies, adopting that on the OT side and realizing they need OT specific visibility tools. I think the next step really now is going to be, okay, let's have our OT specific, access management, extend our identity and access management strategy. And at the same time, let's really manage that attack surface in the OT world. So I think that's going to be a renaissance in sort of the privileged access management world. There's going to be next generation tools that'll be playing. And I think it's going to extend not just to OT, but to critical IT systems as well. So
makes sense. I mean, we still hear so much about people using the admin password and things of that nature. So putting more of those types of tools in place makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I think we're going to move. It's taken a while, but the different types of authentication that don't rely on passwords, I think is going to be a big move here in the next 5 years. So we'll start seeing more, just built-in MFA tools, contextual authentication that we see in the financials. You'll see that more, I think, in other sectors. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are doing, you can check them out at XONAsystems.com. Also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Bill Moore, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.